So the big thing is, sensitive data, and the idea of sensitive data is that certain types of data about certain topics should get more protection in privacy law than other types of data. And I think as a matter of intuition, it seems right? We don't say that all data is equal. There are instances where certain types of issues of privacy are more harmful than other types, right? So I think the instinct is, hey, we don't want to protect everything equally. Certain types of things should be given more protection, and that's what the laws are trying to do. Single out certain types of data for additional protection, stronger than other types of personal data. So here's some types of sensitive data, and I put them here in this slide, and you'll see where we have. Uh, I put like the ones that are recognized in the EU and then some of them that are recognized in US state privacy laws. And we see the EU categories are racial or ethnic origin, health, philosophical and religious beliefs, genetic or biometric data, political opinions, trade union memberships, sex life or sexual orientation. And you'll see that in the US that they recognize some of these categories overlap, but there are other categories that are not recognized in US law, and then some of the things that US law recognizes, the EU doesn't. But these are just some examples of some of the types of personal data that laws recognize. And I think the most common ones are health, racial or ethnic origin, genetic or biometric data, sex life or sexual orientation, although some of the state laws only recognize sexual orientation. Okay. So this is just an example of them, but the laws differ from law to law. You'll have different categories recognized, but there's a lot of common ground. Now, some of the things that the protections provide is that under the U.S. state consumer privacy laws, sensitive data has opt-in consent. Now, under the GDPR, everything has opt-in consent. There are restrictions. In the GDPR, that one of the lawful bases, which is actually one of the most popular lawful bases, which is legitimate interests, sensitive data can't be processed under that basis. So that actually is a big restriction on the use of sensitive data because that's actually um, a very common lawful basis. Now you can still process it with consent, so that's still available, but the legitimate interest lawful basis, and I would say the two lawful bases in the GDPR that are most used are going to be consent and legitimate interests. So this knocks out one of them. And basically another thing that both the US laws and the GDPR does is that it requires a data protection impact assessment when sensitive data is involved. So those are just some of the things. And if you notice, actually, although these protections are stricter, they're not like crazy strict. At the end of the day, you can still process sensitive data. It just typically requires opt-in consent, and you do a data protection impact assessment, which is we'll talk about like how rigorous that is. I think it's often not as rigorous as it should be. So it's not it's not a bar on sensitive data as much as it's just a couple extra hurdles. Okay. Now one of the biggest challenges to sensitive data is inferences. And in the EU and GDPR, inferences count. Uh, that means that if I have pieces of data that are not on their face sensitive, but I could combine those pieces of data to infer sensitive data, then those pieces are sensitive data too. It kind of follows the same rule that personal data follows, right? If you have a couple pieces of non-personal data and you put them together and you get personal data, it's personal data. Same thing with sensitive data. You take pieces that are non-sensitive and you put them together and you can derive sensitive data that then creates the a piece of sensitive data. Now, this creates some challenges because I think then nearly all personal data is sensitive data. And this is the challenge with powerful machine learning algorithms, you can readily make inferences that could capture a sensitive data category. And I think that makes almost all personal data sensitive. Uh, how does this work? Well, you can, with a few pieces of data, you can figure out race because it's a factor of like where people live. And so I could find out where people live. I can find out a couple other things and then put that together and I could infer race on that. And there are a lot of other examples of where inferences could readily be made. One of the things about today, though, is like everything is so politicized. I long for the days. I used to live in a world, and probably you did too, right? When you could buy a pillow and your pillow didn't have politics, where you go to a restaurant, it didn't have politics. Things were just things. And now like they're politicized. Every company has a like a Musk-like or Zuckerberg or somebody who's spouting off and telling you all what they think about their political beliefs and pushing their ideology on you. What about just buy a product? I just want to buy a pillow. I just want to eat a sandwich. I really don't want the politics with it. But the problem is that today everything is politicized, or a lot of things are politicized. So you buy a pillow that could give an inference about your politics. And there's so many other things that you could use to infer, uh, your sensitive data, health, right? All these things go into health. And before I get to location, all these things go into health, like what you do, how many steps you take, fitness, products you buy, where you eat, all that can make inferences about your health, and so on and so forth. Religion, right? What you eat uh, can make inferences about your religious beliefs, where you live, location. Um, where you live could give rise to inferences about race, religion, political opinions. And we know, like in certain zip codes and certain states and certain counties, people, vote, in a certain way politically. And all you do is then you just combine that with other things, and voila, you can find out people's political beliefs. Um, so one of the lessons that we learn from inferences is from the story from Target. I think I told you a little bit about this before, but I'll reiterate it because I think it's such a rich anecdote that helps shed light on so many issues in privacy. And this was a story where Target wanted to figure out who was pregnant. They wanted to figure out customers who were pregnant before they started buying baby products. So early on in the pregnancy, they wanted to determine who was pregnant so that they could start marketing baby stuff to them. And so they had an algorithm that analyzed their purchases. And also keep in mind, this is about more than 10 years ago. So the algorithms are even more sophisticated today. So they used the algorithm to determine who was pregnant, and they were pretty good at it. And in this New York Times story, apparently there's an anecdote where this father goes to Target and says, a teenage girl goes to Target and says, "Hey, I don't understand why my daughter's being sent all these ads for baby products." Well, it turns out that she was in fact pregnant but hadn't told him yet. And so this ran, and there was a big backlash against this. People said this is kind of creepy that Target's figuring out who's pregnant, without people telling them that they're pregnant, figuring out it without people's consent. And what was it that actually gave rise to this? Well, it was based on their purchases. And things like buying unscented products, buying cotton balls were some of the things that triggered the algorithm to say that someone was pregnant. And the algorithm did it by just looking at buying patterns, over millions of people. The takeaway from this for sensitive data is that there are a lot of things that could give rise to an inference about something sensitive, right? Pregnancy is health, and it's a very sensitive matter, especially in today's day and age where, post-Dobbs world. Well, if this inference could readily be made, um, that means that it's very hard for us to just use common sense or to figure out, like, well, what is health data? How do I know what's health data if some algorithm somewhere could figure out some piece of data that I have no idea could give a rise to an inference about health, suddenly gives a rise to an inference about health. And the problem is if it could be things as innocuous as a couple things you buy at a store, just think about all the other types of sensitive data that could be inferred from all sorts of other types of data. And that means that it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, for people to figure out what exactly is sensitive data if we're going to count inferences. And if we don't count inferences, then the sensitive data becomes kind of meaningless because you just use other data as proxies for sensitive data, and then you can do an end run around it. So this is the problem with it. Um, uh, we really just can't predict many of the inferences algorithms make. And that's going to make it really, really hard then to figure out what sensitive data is. And if you think about it, companies need to make this determination at the get-go, right? Because before you collect sensitive data, it's either opt-in or opt-out. So before I start collecting data about your purchases, I need to know, is it sensitive or not? Well, how am I going to know that? And there you have to do a data protection impact assessment and other things. So it's going to becomes really tricky for companies to figure this out. And then also, when companies have the data, they need to label it. And so typically companies do a data map and then they label the data as personal data, and then they'll label the data that's sensitive data so they can know, okay, this data gets this different kind of treatment. But if you don't know what data is sensitive or not, how do you label it? How do you map it? How do you then determine that it should get heightened protection internally? And it's really hard to do it. I don't know how they can figure that out. Now, the other problem with this is that there are a lot of blurry lines. What exactly counts as a religious belief? Is atheism a religious belief, or is that not a religious belief? If I say, hey, I don't believe in religion, I believe in science. Well, is that religion or is that non-religion? What exactly is that? What religions count for a religious belief beyond the traditional religions? Does everything count or not? What about a philosophical belief? What exactly is a philosophical belief? Because some people will say, well, does that mean it has to be, Aristotle? Um, uh, I think one of the things in philosophy, there's a big debate over what counts as philosophy. And so a lot of some philosophies say some other philosophies are not philosophy. There are other philosophies that say, that science and empirical evidence and sociology and other types of things count as philosophy. And so, in essence, it's very hard to determine in someone's belief system, okay, I have a belief system. What is philosophical? What's religious? What's scientific? What's something else? And a lot of times people's beliefs are mixed, right? Some religions have certain beliefs about science, they have beliefs about the world, they have beliefs about philosophy, and philosophies have that too. It's interrelated. So the lines are blurry. How do we carve out what a philosophical belief is? I think that if you really want to be faithful to this, any belief that I have, any belief, whether it's science, it's philosophy, or it's religion or something, counts. So that would mean anything I believe, would count. So, you have like a fan, like I believe that, anything that, Kim Kardashian says is true, you know, why doesn't that count? So that's the problem. Um, I think sensitive data is a dead end. It just doesn't work. I think people want it to work. I think it sounds nice, but it just doesn't work in today's age of data. The categories are not neatly circumscribed. They are almost impossible to figure out what's in or out of the categories. And I think this deals with a fundamental conceptual mistake that I think a lot of the laws are making. and that's they embrace an idea that personal data is a useful focal point, the nature of the data. I don't think you can just look to the data itself. I think the nature of the data just doesn't, get you where you need to go. Ultimately, I think we should focus on the extent of harm or risk of harm from the data collection. Now, we would say, look, is a person's address sensitive data? And the answer that most would say is no, right? We don't have a category in sensitive data um, for addresses. But that can be a life or death matter, right? If there's someone who is unpopular and they're being threatened and their life could be in danger, they're under death threats, well, their address can really matter. If it's a domestic violence victim that's trying to hide out from a potentially dangerous ex, that also is a life and death matter. And I think that, it's really hard to say, there's certain pieces of data are inherently harmful or not inherently harmful. It depends on how they're used. Depends on the context and the circumstance. And so I think instead of trying to use sensitive data as a proxy for harm, why don't we just look at harm directly and look at harm and risk? So I think basically data is what data does. And I think that's the better way to understand personal data and its protection and protect it based on how it is used and the risks it can create.